Now, I'm not talking about migrant workers in this session, but I know you will be later. So I've just put this graph up because we've also looked at migrant workers. And you'll see some similar explained, unexplained purple there. It might be something that you're interested in for one of the later sessions. So, but I just thought it would be interesting to put it up and show that there's similar patterns when we look at migrant workers, similar patterns when we look at informal and formal sector workers. Okay. Now just quickly on to the motherhood pay gap. So we've talked about the gender pay gap. Clearly, if you're a woman, there's going to be a pay gap, and a lot of that is not going to be explained except by discrimination. Okay. So we've got that just because you're a woman. Now if you're a mother, there's going to be an even higher pay gap. There's going to be a pay penalty. And we've just started looking into that research. Thank you. So we know that women are different. Some are mothers, some are not mothers. Some have one child, some have 3 children. And we're starting to look at all that data and see what is making the difference and what are the policy responses that support mothers so that they don't have those motherhood pay gaps. Interestingly, bigger penalty, motherhood penalty in developing countries, perhaps not surprisingly, about 42% in the countries we've looked at. But what is interesting in developing countries is the sex of the child matters. So if you have a daughter, you will have a lower penalty than if you have a son, because your daughter is going to be at home looking after the chores. So also interesting, your level of education. The pay penalty goes up if you're higher educated. It also goes up if you're married or divorced. If you're a single mother, your penalty is actually lower. So, I mean, I think it's important that we start looking at these different facets of pay and pay penalties, because that actually helps our responses. So what are some of the policies that we need to be looking at? Now, we've looked at a whole range of countries, a whole range of research out there, and we can see that, number one, we need protected maternity leave. Now, this is the Goldilocks syndrome now. If it's too long, you get a penalty. If it's too short, you get a penalty. It has to be just right. And it has to be paid, but not paid by the employer. If it's entirely paid by the employer, your penalty will go up, and quite frankly, you're unlikely to get the job because you cost too much. So, not too long, not too short, just right, and paid by the state. So that is one of the key policies for reducing the pay penalty. Accessible childcare, really, really important. Now, we have issues about the school schedule as well. I live in France. When my son first went to school, the school day was from 8:30 to 4:30. Fantastic. Yeah, that works. I can live with that. With a 2-hour lunch break and no canteen. What on earth am I going to do for 2 hours in the middle of the day? So the length of the school day, the provision that you have within the school system really, really makes a difference. So those issues are important. Flexible working arrangements, again, it can be good, it can be bad. Really depends on the context. And flexibility is often about flexibility for the employer, not for the worker. So be really careful when we talk about flexibility. And just very, very quickly, the tax and benefit systems, I think other people will talk about that, and they're probably much more knowledgeable about that than I am, but often tax systems assume women are secondary earners. And because it assumes that, they will be, because they're penalized if they're primary earners. So tax systems, really, really important. And then just overall work-family policies, we have to get more men involved. We have to have systems that say, yes, parenting is also about fathers. Increase in paternity leave, enormous since Beijing, for the last 20 years, but we're still only 47% of countries that have paternity leave, any paternity leave. I don't know whether it's a day or 90 days, any paternity leave, 47% of countries. So this changing of family responsibilities and making men also responsible is going to be absolutely critical. And I'm going to stop there and just say that this is going to be one of the issues that the ILO will be drilling down into in the next couple of years. The Director General has launched the Women at Work Centenary Initiative. The ILO will be 100 years in 2019. We are the first UN agency, well, we come out of the League of Nations. And after 100 years, we need to have something really important to show for it with respect to women at work. And we really want to focus on care. We want to focus on that work-family combination, and really to make a difference and have a new blueprint by 2019 for how we improve women's access to work, women's retention to work, and just overall the goals for society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shauna, and I know these are issues that will then continue through the rest of the panel discussion, since we are going to be looking at different forms of work, and I'm sure your framework is going to really help us explore some of these issues later. We'd like to shift gears now and look at the funding side, or a different approach to money. So the resources available to fund initiatives to promote gender equality and women's empowerment post-2015. The glass half full perspective would say, wow, there are all of these new sources of funding, including from the private sector or more private sector oriented approaches, structuring of the social development bonds, development impact bonds. There are also new sources of funding that are provided by more traditional donors, but for specific issue areas, environment, climate being one of them. So I'd like to turn it over to Liana to talk to us about the review she's been doing, the work she's been doing, engaging with the organizers of this new climate fund that's been set up, and what she sees as the risks and opportunities there for the gender equality agenda.
Great. Thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you very much to UN Women and Columbia University for inviting me here today. I really appreciate being part of this discussion because I think it's very important, finance per se, obviously finance for gender equality and women's empowerment particularly, but even more important, and if you look actually at the official development assistance flows and see that just a small percentage, I think it's around 20% of official ODA, is categorized as having either a primary or principal gender equality impact, then I think it's even more important to look at finance provision for sectors, for development overall, or for climate, which is what I'm going to do, and try and figure out how can we actually ensure that money that is directed to address issues for development or finance purposes is gender responsive. And my goal would be there, and again I speak primarily on the climate finance side, to say my goal would be I want 100% gender responsive climate financing. This is not the same as saying 100% financing for gender equality, but actually climate change financing that takes into account and addresses the need of men and women and makes sure that the benefit, the outcomes of the financing that Radhika was talking about actually accrue equally and equitably to both men and women. And obviously the focus on climate change is very important for two reasons. One is looking at it as the threat to the ability to actually have better development outcomes and make progress in the Sustainable Development Goals, but also limiting the progress that we already have made with the Millennium Development Goals, as reductionist as they might be. But I think it's also the question of the larger structural context, because climate change is actually the biggest outcome of the structural mess of the globalization, economic and financial system that we have. Climate change is often addressed as basically the biggest market failure, and I think we need to be very careful, and this is a trend that is happening in climate finance provision, to not try to then address with markets the climate change failures and threats that were created by the inefficiency and the inability of markets to take into account a lot of the considerations, including unpaid work, that we are looking here at. So obviously climate finance is a key means of the provision, a means of implementation for climate action. Just to point out that there is no clear definition of what climate finance is. Generally, it refers to money to address mitigation and adaptation challenges, and it's also not a new phenomenon. Climate funds and climate change financing has been around for a while. For example, the Global Environment Facility, which is 20 years old, has had funding for climate change action since the very beginning. But since the climate summit in Copenhagen in 2009, we had a new focus on climate change financing. At the same time, we also had a proliferation of dozens of new actors that came on there in form of dedicated climate financing initiatives. Some multilateral, a lot of them bilateral, a lot of them, very importantly, the same actors that are also engaged in development finance. So in terms of the actor and the implementation, there is often not necessarily a separation between development finance implementation and climate finance implementation. And what made the Copenhagen summit so important is that for the first time they set out a financial goal, and that was the 100 billion per year by 2020 from a variety of sources. Now the challenge there, and the challenge of climate finance versus development assistance, is that conceptually it is understood to be very different from development finance. It is not aid. Climate finance is an obligation, a provision under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, under the UNFCCC. It is seen as a payment obligation resulting from something called the equity principle within the UNFCCC, namely the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And I think that goes a little bit in the direction that Akido said. It acknowledges the fact that countries have very different starting points, and with that all of them have a responsibility to act, but a lot of them have very differentiated capabilities to act. Okay, I'm already seeing that I'm running out here of time, so I have to go a little bit faster. So the question of additionality, getting additional finance for the provision of action on climate change is important, because what you don't want is a relabeling of development finance as climate finance and detracting from the overall pool. And that is very important for the discussion that are ongoing in that context, for the financing for development, for the new climate agreement, for the sustainable development goals. So, because of that, because you have a very tight public finance provision, I think it becomes even more important that the finance to use is used in a very comprehensive, holistic way, and actually pursues what I would call multi-benefit approaches, where it's very clear that you're trying to achieve a number of goals, a number of incentives within the financing. And I think that's particularly critical with climate finance, because the way the current practice in a lot of the climate financing instruments is a too narrow focus on climate action can actually hurt and discriminate even further against women. And I just put out two examples really briefly. One is clean energy provision, for example, through large dams. On the side of it, something very good, but not if it comes with forced resettlement, if it comes with the loss of livelihood of women, and we know that women in compensation schemes usually don't get the same compensation as men, or alternative livelihoods. Biofuels would be another area where you have land grab happening in the name of biofuel crop cultivation, and where really some of the food security issues, particularly of smallholder women farmers, a lot of them without ownership rights to the land that they cultivate, are threatened. So we need to keep that in mind. But also in the finance provision, and I think that applies relatively equally to both climate finance and development finance, but is particularly strong in climate finance, you have a couple of inherent biases that actually make it harder to have those gender responsive financing outcomes. One is the effectiveness discourse of finance, particularly in climate finance, but I think ultimately for development finance. It's similar that effectiveness of finance is often equated with cost effectiveness. Now, we know that if you're talking about effectiveness only in terms of cost effectiveness, that you are actively discriminating against the number of the small-scale, more community-based financing initiatives that you actually would like to see supported. Another inherent bias is the one towards large-scale technological fixes, where you're not looking at some of the appropriate technologies, a lot of them building on local knowledge and local tradition, but actually trying to go in with very costly high technology. And I think, for example, the current focus on carbon capture and storage, a largely unproven but extremely expensive technology, as a way to basically allow us all to continue happily polluting as we have done the entire time, is one of those areas where you ask yourself, couldn't that money be spent much better? Then the third point is the results measurement. And I think this is a critical